All right, hello everybody, and welcome to the 7th HWISE-NOW virtual coffee hour. I'm Justin, talking to you from the mask right here. We're delighted that you've taken time to join us today in our discussion of household water insecurity and disaster recovery. Really timely topic, if you've been paying attention. For the past few months, we convened several of these HWISE-NOW episodes with great success. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and remind everyone that we have more engaging conversations booked through early 2022, with the details coming soon. The HWISE-NOW series has been an exciting success that has extended our professional networks and actually spawned a few new research collaborations, and we hope to maintain this energy. Now, for those new to HWISE, I'll introduce myself. I'm Justin Stoller, an associate professor at the University of Miami in Florida, actually coming live to you from my own water insecurity course, where we've got 30 students, all trying to stay as quiet as possible. So some of the best camera work we've probably seen on HWISE-NOW, I know. I generally study global environmental health disparities, and if we haven't met, you can learn more about me on my new lab site. I'm also one of Wendy Jepson's co-pilots of the Household Water Insecurity Experiences Research Coordination Network, or HWISE-RCN, a collaboration that has been ongoing for many years. You can get the link to that in the chat. With the financial support of the National Science Foundation, we have built a community of practice that fosters theoretical and methodological advances to study the causes and outcomes of water insecurity at the household scale. We'd also like to acknowledge the many contributions, some of which we'll have time to mention today, of our colleagues at the National Science Foundation funded HWISE-RCN. For members of the audience who would like to learn more, please visit our website and join our community. Now, speaking of, I want to remind our audience that HWISE released a new call for proposals for the HWISE Collaborator Accelerator Award. This new program aims to convene small teams of researchers, generally teams of 2 or 3, to accelerate new theoretical, methodological, analytical, outreach and educational collaborations related to household water insecurity. This award will support researchers with $1,000 to $2,000 towards scholarly and creative costs. Please see our webpage for details, specifically under the project menu, or you can always email us. There's our email in the chat for details. Applications are due September 15th, so just about 15 days away. As a reminder, we are recording this event and we'll host it on the HWISE YouTube channel after the talk. And our format, with that YouTube channel link there for you, our format is designed to be an informal discussion, and we encourage your questions and comments. And we request that you type those into the chat box, which I'll be monitoring, whole team will be monitoring throughout our conversation today. So before beginning our conversation, we of course will introduce our panelists, but feel free to post questions anytime. Our goal is to keep this conversational. So let's finally introduce our discussants. Enough from me. Please tell us a bit about who you are, where you work, and give a brief overview of how your research and scholarship intersects with household water insecurity and disaster recovery. And let's start with Samir.
Guess I got to take myself off mute first. So thanks, Justin, and to the HWISE-RCN for organizing this session. Clearly, it's an important one given the current events around Ida, Haiti, and other disasters that have been happening worldwide. So my name is Samir, and I'm a visiting scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, working in coordination with the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, where I'll transition into a postdoctoral role shortly. So at UM, my work will contribute to ongoing research efforts to understand social and political drivers of vulnerability in disaster contexts, and will also support equity-based approaches to inform disaster responses to mitigate the disproportionately larger risks and consequences for vulnerable groups during and after extreme events. To date, my interests in disaster preparedness have largely focused around concerns of environmental change and resource-based livelihoods in the global south, with my most recent research studying the equity and sustainability implications of an over $1 billion government-led program in Western India to create drought-free and water-secure villages. And this work has highlighted how resilience interventions can be maladaptive and fail to protect historically disadvantaged groups, such as upland farmers, small and marginal farmers, and others who face significant risks from environmental change. So I look forward to bringing that kind of context into our discussion today.
Thanks so much. Can we next introduce Anais?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Anais Roque. I have a PhD in environmental social science from Arizona State University. And currently I'm a postdoctoral research scholar working with an interdisciplinary team in the US border colonias on the United States side. These are communities that are 150 miles away from the border and that lack basic infrastructure such as water infrastructure and hence suffer from water insecurity. The way that I think about disasters and water insecurity stems both from my personal experiences. I'm originally from Puerto Rico, and in 2017, we had a big hurricane event called Hurricane Maria. And during that event, I worked as a shelter administrator, and I saw firsthand how water insecurity was manifesting, right? Like people were getting out of the houses, they were evacuating, the critical infrastructure had broken. We had a power outage that lasted up to 11 months in some communities, and to this day, there's still power outages. So my research has focused on water sharing practices, meaning inter-household water exchanges to meet drinking and sanitation needs. So that's how I've been thinking about disasters and thinking about the political landscape that really shapes this, because I think it's important to highlight that disasters are not natural events, right? We have hazards that are becoming more extreme due to anthropogenic climate change. And when those interact with vulnerable communities due to lack of political stability and mismanagement, we have these crises, including water insecurity. So that's how I take an approach on household water insecurity and disasters.
And certainly last but not least, Victoria.
Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. Thanks for attending. My name is Victoria. I am a current PhD student at Texas A&M University. I just started, so it's kind of my second day as a PhD student, but I'm at the Department of Geography working under Dr. Wendy Jepson. I just graduated with my master's also at Texas A&M. And that's where my experiences are with water insecurity and disasters. My research looked at how Hurricane Harvey, which hit Texas in 2017, impacted water systems in Southeast Texas. Just to put in context, Southeast Texas, my case study site was about 1 to 2 hours from Louisiana. So everything that's going on with Louisiana right now, I saw those things also to some degree in my research. So broadly, I looked at how did Hurricane Harvey impact water systems and frankly, what impacted their recovery capabilities. So my project originally was going to look more at the household level and the homeowners, but with the pandemic, there was a big shift in my research halfway through, and that just wasn't probable. So I began to look more at water operators and their water systems, and how were these operators able to recover and improve water system, and what created barriers to these systems and their improvements, and how did this affect households? So just why did I get interested in this was mostly because I'm actually from South Florida. I grew up there my entire life. My family's still there. So I've had hurricanes every step of the way. I've dealt with preparation. And so I've just really been interested for a while about hurricanes because it's something that I experienced a lot, and I could see just living in Florida is no matter a minor hurricane can be extremely catastrophic if something like a main life supply like power or water is cut off for an extended period of time. And I think that's something that really interested me and influenced my research now is just how we misconceive a hurricane, for example. It has to be a big one to impact people. It can be a small one, it can be a tropical storm, it could just be a bad thunderstorm that influences people's water security. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here. Like I said, I'm just kind of starting in the academia research world, so I'm really excited to be here with all of you to learn and talk more. So thanks for having me.
Well, thank you, Victoria, and thanks so much, everyone. And again, we're so delighted and grateful to have you all here. I'll continue our conversation about disaster recovery by noting that household water insecurity is often portrayed by the media as a consequence of natural disasters and extreme weather events. We've seen that played out just in the last few days here in the southeastern United States. The media like to show images of pallets of bottled water being delivered to recovery sites and often casts water insecurity as a temporary or ephemeral state related to interrupted infrastructure, but not as a permanent problem. But we know now with more precision than ever before that water insecurity does tend to exacerbate vulnerability to virtually any disaster. And again, as you've all mentioned, look at the current pandemic, the recent earthquake in Haiti, or Hurricane Ida that just churned through Louisiana. So I'm interested in your thoughts on framing household water insecurity as a critical component of disaster preparedness, as some of you have already hinted. Maybe Anais, we can start with you, given your experience with Hurricane Maria.
Sure, thanks. So I think that in terms of framing household water insecurity as a critical component of disaster preparedness, it's really to think about the context in which these disasters occur, right? So similar to what Victoria just shared, right? It doesn't have to be a Category 4 hurricane in order to create a disaster. And in the context of compounded crisis, so for example, in the case of Puerto Rico, where there is an economic recession in 2006, there is unemployment, right? There's these social vulnerability components. When the hazard interacts with a weak physical infrastructure, at the end of the day, who gets affected by this cascade effect is the household. And I think that the literature has done a really good job in framing disaster in terms of thinking about resilience and thinking about environmental justice, social vulnerability, but not really thinking about specific resource scarcity. So in this sense, thinking about food insecurity, water insecurity, energy insecurity, how all of these interact and affect the day of day. So I think in that sense, it's important to think about preparedness as part of that disaster, management cycle, but also step a little bit back and think about the root causes that put these systems weak in the first place. Thinking about the political dimensions, the economic dimension, and thinking about the social cultural dimensions of water insecurity. Because I think water insecurity is just the end product. We really have to step a little bit back and not also put the preparedness at the household level. Think really also about the state and how are they even preparing to support communities. And I'll just give one quick example. So after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, for example, right, like because there was a lack of preparedness because we have hurricanes every other year, and people thought, it's like the story of the wolf is coming, but it never comes. It's like we have this small storm, but everybody prepares, but it's not really. And then you actually have this big event. The lack of preparedness from the part of the government in terms of like announcing and really setting households to really prepare was really what created the disaster. That's the end product. So in that sense, we really have to also shift also the conversation of now it's important, yes, for households to prepare for water, but also think about the larger systems that are putting these vulnerabilities in the first place. Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria. Did you want to add on to that? And then we'll come back to Samir.
Yeah, like everything Anais said, I full-heartedly agree with. And something that really, when I was doing my research and I was doing my thesis and writing it the last couple of months, something that really stuck out to me, and especially in the news with like thinking about the earthquake in Haiti, is that how difficult it is to prepare for a disaster that you can't predict. With hurricanes, for example, there's still barriers, of course, with just people being able to go get the resource, or be available, people being able to afford it. But in the sense that you can at least predict a few days in advance if a hurricane is coming. And also we have hurricane season, so you know that within these 4 months, be prepared in case a hurricane happens. But I think a lot about earthquakes, like in Haiti. How do you prepare for that? How does a household prepare for a disaster that can be at any second, and we don't know when? And so I full-heartedly think that water security should be part of the disaster preparedness, but it's so incredibly difficult for it to be at the household level for these unpredictable disasters. And that's where, like Anais was just saying about how do we hold the higher levels of, state, of federal, how do we hold other scales of government responsible? Because water security, at the end of the day, something that came up with someone that I talked to in my research is that, after Hurricane Harvey, pallets and pallets of water were able to come. And so they were able to help people in the short term, but what they're still struggling is long-term water security, because their systems still don't have the upgrades and the infrastructure is still lacking in the improvements needed to ensure long-term water security for disaster and preparing long-term. And so to some degree, I think something that came up a lot in my research that I thought a lot about is how can we make it so that different scales of government are held accountable and also improve water security? And how do we get them to include water security in disaster preparedness? Because again, there's just so much a household can do at the individual level. It's a collective thing that needs to be improved on.
So I'll jump in and just say, I'd like to just echo what everyone has said so far. Water insecurity is not merely just an outcome of disasters, but through my research and experience has shown to be a precondition for producing and amplifying disaster outcomes as well. So just, as everyone has alluded, I think this kind of perspective kind of pushes us away from viewing disasters as purely, as a function of how much rain falls from the sky during a monsoon, or, how strong a hurricane really is, and into recognizing that historical and contemporary distributions of power and resource distribution in society, which affect, for example, whether certain groups can acquire public water infrastructure and have access to it, or even invest in deep bore wells. It affects those kinds of dynamics which play a role in potentially mitigating environmental stressors. The second point I just kind of want to get back to is, just because we understand water security as a means for mitigating certain kinds of disaster outcomes or risk outcomes, doesn't mean that all interventions in that way will be supportive of that goal. So one kind of broad finding from my research in India is that water conservation activities such as small dams or farm ponds, or rejuvenation projects, deepening of streams to protect communities from drought, can actually reinforce existing patterns of unequal and unsustainable water distribution and use, which will not and does not result in broadly distributed gains to protect entire communities, and especially marginalized residents who we know face the strongest and largest impacts from climate risk. So what I'm kind of getting at is, without changing the distribution of power and resources, as well as modes of how we use water in certain contexts, we really risk creating these maladaptive contexts and outcomes which could heighten vulnerability to disasters in many ways. So even when we recognize the role of water security in reducing disasters, how we do things really matters. And I just want to echo one thing that Anais had said in terms of, creating and sustaining water security is really important, because a failure to do so can create these cumulative crises, particularly for disadvantaged groups. So I'm thinking, consequences would extend far beyond the impacts of a drought, and far beyond, a farmer losing their seasonal crop, and into, high interest lending or labor bondage over several years. And these kinds of dynamics really affect people's endowments, their entitlements, their capabilities, and can reinforce someone's heightened risk in the context of future disasters. So yeah, just overall, I'm thinking, household water security, as we discussed, does play an important role in mediating hazard impacts, but processes of engendering water security need to move beyond moving and transporting water. And a failure to do so, as we've discussed, has ramifications far beyond a specific moment of crisis.
I want to pick up on this theme of vulnerability that came up in each of your comments, and given water insecurity's role as a keystone vulnerability, and we could probably consider household water insecurity and natural disasters, extreme weather events, and so forth. They're really vulnerability multipliers in different ways. So we know that given its role as a vulnerability multiplier, a keystone vulnerability, water insecurity has been acknowledged as an important part of climate resilience planning, and this often brings us back to conversations about infrastructure. So infrastructure across North America is infamously reaching the end of its life expectancy. Some of these systems are over a century old and is increasingly vulnerable to rising seas, floods, and fires. We saw all of these examples just over the last year. Last fall, we saw the flooding from tropical storms. We're again seeing that just in the last 48 hours. The fires out in California, even the polar vortex in Texas that was freezing water lines and creating all sorts of water insecurity in places that weren't used to having to deal with that, certainly at that time of year. So public funding of infrastructure, it just isn't sexy, right? As we just saw with that infrastructure bill that US Congress just barely squeaked through over the last week. So how can we keep water infrastructure at the top of the policy agenda with household water insecurity, perhaps giving the issue a more human face? Anais, can you start us off?
Sure. You know, I'm wrapping my head around that question. That's a really good question. I have two answers on that. So on one side, I think that the funding is always there. You know, the money is always there. It's just that the communities that are being disproportionately impacted by water insecurity are not in the forefront of those conversations. So for example, I think about Flint. I think about the Colonia communities. I think about North Carolina, right? I think about Puerto Rico, right? Like I think about all these brown and Black faces that are the, you know, social demographics and economic demographics of these communities. And they've been experiencing these for years, but they just don't get a seat in the table and they're able to even be part of those conversations. And then you have bills like this water infrastructure that is aiming to address water infrastructure, but we still, and I also quickly skimmed over it, it doesn't really have a structure on how those resources are gonna go from a federal level up to a local community. So for example, like in places like the Colonia communities, they don't really sometimes have the technical expertise to be able to write a grant. And for that, they need to be able to connect with local government, which there already are some trust issues in that sense. So that at the end hampers the opportunity for more funding distribution to be able to be allocated at the local or at the regional level. And then I also think that, you know, how more human can we get if we know that without water, we can't live? Like, you know, like I think that when people don't sometimes, because, you know, it's not your experience, we tend to overthink about it. But I bet if we do an experiment with congressmen and we put them 3 days without water, they will change their perspectives, right? Like, and to this end, like they are responding to interests that are not necessarily the people that are really being disproportionately impacted, you know, and Dr. Meehan and Dietz, like they did this PNAS great article, and it's the research is out there, right? We're coming with new metrics and new ways of really understanding and being more proactive in terms of trying to bridge with policymakers to help them, you know, support a lot of these things in a more applied sense. But at the end of the day, like it's a shift of political leadership. Who are the leaders that are guiding these water bills? Who are the leaders that are guiding our communities? What are their values? And I think that will be key to both put a more human face to water insecurity, but also to be able to, that money that exists, like be able to actually translate into action. So, yeah.
Victoria or Samir, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can jump in. So yeah, this question, it definitely got me thinking a lot also while I was, again, writing my thesis of how do we hold people accountable? How do we put a top policy agenda? And to be the most transparent, I still don't fully know, but something that at least I can contribute to this conversation about is definitely sharing the stories of those affected is one of the most important things that I learned. So my research project started because a staff member in the College of Geosciences here at A&M brought it to Wendy and I's attention. She was a resident of Port Arthur, which is one of my case study sites. And she brought it to Wendy's attention originally and said, hey, I don't know if you know, but this town that's a very important like refinery and oil town in Texas, still having so many problems following Hurricane Harvey with their water, but it's just not in the news because you see in the news like Houston, which was an hour away from Port Arthur, they're the ones getting all the funding. They're the ones getting, because they're a big city, but this small town that is still crucial to Texas just isn't getting the news coverage. It isn't getting the funding. It isn't getting attention. And so that's kind of how my project originally started, is kind of word of mouth, hearing the story from a native of Port Arthur. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is from there, sharing the stories was really important for me because for my research, like I said, it included water operators. And one operator talked about how when they received funding from the state and federal level for repairing their water systems, they were only given the amount of money to essentially replace the broken parts. But they were able to recognize that their systems were lacking some really crucial flood-proofing infrastructure. So one of them was, for example, elevating all the electrical components, the control panels and the generators about 4 to 8 feet high, so that sure, if there's a catastrophic flood event, it's inevitable for it to be flooded, but for minor hurricanes, for minor flood events, for minor things, it doesn't have to be disastrous because it's elevated. So even if flood water gets into their facilities, it's not underwater. But when they proposed this to the state and federal, agencies for funding, they were denied. They were told that, no, I'm sorry, all we can provide you with the insurance is to fix your immediate damages. We can't provide any other funding for future issues or to flood-proof your systems. And the water operator talked a lot about how so frustrating that was because they work there. They know what these water systems need to improve water security for a future disaster, but they don't get the support because the agencies, just the way everything is written, the way that money has to be allocated, they're not allowed to do that. And so, do I know how to get that to the top of the policy agenda? No, frankly, I don't yet. I do agree giving a human face, sharing the stories is really important. But I think at least what I found really important is until we can reach that point where it is at the top of the policy agenda, at least we can recognize and we can place what are the improvements that need to happen and what needs to be implemented and what changes need to happen at the policy level. And secondly, my other thought to that was when I was thinking about this question is, growing up, like I said, I'm from Florida. It wasn't until truthfully I started my master's that when I heard 500-year flood event, I didn't truly know what that meant ever. You would hear it in the news, but I had no idea. And it wasn't until I started researching it. And so I really think, trying to get the message across of like how bad a 500-year flood event truly is and how bad the long-term effects are. Because again, we can all think of images that happen, but we don't really understand the long-term effects. And so kind of reporting it, documenting it, social media has really improved people's ability to hear about events that are hundreds of miles away from them, but be able to understand the gravity of the situation. So I think translating it into terms that people can easily understand and they have a lot of access to, because like Anais kind of said, that provides pressure to the politicians. If a lot of people are very passionate, if a lot of people are speaking out about this, that provides pressure to make this on the top of the policy agenda.
When I think about these kinds of questions, the first thing that comes to mind is, water infrastructure is on the top of the policy agenda, but for certain communities. And for other communities, it's either actively ignored or actually purposely stripped away, particularly for low income and racialized communities. And I think this gets back to what both of you were saying earlier in terms of this idea of environmental citizenship, like who is and who is not perceived to be a citizen, because that does contribute to and has sustained very unequal patterns in water infrastructure and water access. For example, First Nation communities and rampant boil water advisories, to municipal underbounding or what's called public service gerrymandering, to cases like Flint, Michigan, or Sand Branch, Texas, that are replicated across North America and globally in different contexts. So I think just quickly, you know, the notion of the human face, what that constitutes does explain a lot about water infrastructure and contemporary and historical water struggles. So Justin, I'm kind of just wondering, you know, like, may we also frame the question as, you know, how can we actually move up inclusion and anti-racism efforts to the top of the policy ladder in ways that will serve water infrastructure expansion for marginalized and disenfranchised communities? So perhaps it's maybe that question as well, you know, moving that to the top, which will, you know, allow water infrastructure to be better funded or receive better attention and so forth. And again, this gets back to what Anais's very first point was, in the, you know, representation really does matter, and it matters in explicitly for contexts like this.
That's really a great point, Samir, and it's certainly within the purview of HWISE's mission in terms of what we're trying to keep on the agenda. And so I want to throw back, it's not so much a curveball, but in those types of communities that have been marginalized, racialized, where leadership has utterly failed, whether, you know, deliberately or not, could you give examples from each of your respective research areas? You've all done field work on multiple continents, of ways that local communities have coped, the types of informal infrastructure that's arisen and so forth. How is human ingenuity helping communities kind of stay on their feet and get on with life when leaders are failing them? And
I can bring an example. So a central thesis in my work is water sharing activities. And in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, really the people were able to be water secure because they use their social networks, meaning their family connections, their neighbor connections, these other connections across, to be able to get water. And they will do different arrangements. So for example, they would, like, within the household, they will say, well, we are going to the water tank at the city municipality, but you are going with this group to the river to get water. Right, and water for different purposes, water for drinking, water for sanitation. And then you have other examples where people were volunteering and trying to create larger groups to go to the more rural communities that they knew the physical infrastructure had failed terribly, and that, you know, FEMA, the Army, and all these other entities were not being able to get, either because they couldn't or because they didn't know how to get there. So in this sense, really these social infrastructures that are being created through social networks is one of the ways in which people, in the case of the disaster after Hurricane Maria, were coping. And that lasted, you know, from weeks up to months, and it really depended on a household and case by case. But I do think that, you know, like you mentioned in your question, it is a coping mechanism that will support maybe a couple weeks, maybe a couple months, but similar to what Victoria and Samir are speaking, it doesn't really, it's just a patch. It's a Band-Aid to a really larger problem. And although they were able to cope, a lot of the participants that I interviewed, they were saying that, you know, there were different pains. You know, there was the worry of water. There was the worry they're going to do a line of, you know, 100 people, and by the time they get to the front, they were not going to be able to get enough water, or they'll get just like 6 bottles of water, or the worry of how, you know, heavy water was to lift or transport, right? Because I think that we haven't dived in this conversation is that when a hazard like an earthquake or a hurricane impacts, and it affects, like in the case with Hurricane Ida, the energy grid, really that impacts out more than the water. It also impacts the transportation system and impacts all these other, the food system, right? So in that way, water insecurity becomes one of the resource insecurities in this larger context. And because you don't have maybe access to electricity, or you don't have access to the gas station, you're not being able to move and be able to get water. Because if you live in a more, in an urban community that doesn't have really good transportation system, like in the case of Puerto Rico, to move 2-3 miles, it's a long walk. And maybe other communities across the world are more used to this type of dynamics, but when it just happens, it's also like a shock, right? So the health, the psychosocial dimensions of that are also amplifying. People just get in shock. So the different reactions, right? There's different responses, but definitely there is a strong sense that people will support each other and they will reciprocate to address water insecurity, but in a very short-term responsive rather than a proactive preparedness component. And sorry, I think I took too much of the time. Please others share.
Yeah, so something that I first thought of when thinking about this question that was, again, for example, in my case today was Port Arthur. Port Arthur is a low-income minority community, and they are always struggling with water security. They are always struggling with hurricanes, with flooding, with droughts. They're also along the Sabine River, so they also have levee systems that flood and break and leak. So Port Arthur is just hit with so many different types of disasters all the time. And so something I was thinking about is something I brought up during one of my interviews is their local government, so their mayor, they are actually very passionate about getting the funding so people can have good livelihoods in the area. But the problem is the way that Port Arthur works is they get some federal money given to them to help them with infrastructure and to help them with funding various projects throughout the city and the town, but only if their populations stay above 50,000 people. But Port Arthur right now is experiencing just every year when they do data on populations, at least 1,000 people a year have been leaving because people just don't have incentive to stay there anymore because they are constantly faced with flooding, with water insecurity. They're constantly faced with so many just disasters that people don't see the point in staying. So the mayor there is just constantly having this battle of trying to incentivize people to stay so that they can keep their funding, so that they can improve infrastructure, but also they don't have the money yet to actually implement everything, or they don't have enough money yet in funds to implement everything, so people are leaving. So I would, for my research at least, the local governments are failing, yes, but not because they aren't trying. They're failing just because the system has made it so that they're kind of already at a disadvantage. They need people to stay to get this money, but people don't want to stay because of the disaster. So they're kind of stuck in this vicious cycle. And so it kind of brings the question of what should the state do? Like, what can the state and the federal government do to help these local governments who are low income minority and are just already at a disadvantage? And then the second thing I thought about was, again, like I said, my researchers with the water operators, they really, almost all of them talked, without me honestly even prompting them, talked about how post-disaster, post-hurricane, including the winter storm that we had, Winter Storm Uri, they talked about how they really relied on one another, the network within the water operators. It didn't matter if they were public water operators and worked for the municipal governments. It didn't matter if they were private. It came from so many different states, so many different cities, that there's just such an elaborate network that they rely on one another immediately following a disaster, because it is so difficult for them to get help from the government. Because like I said earlier, to get funding, there's so many people you have to talk to, so many agencies. There's a whole paperwork process, but when your water systems are broken, you can't wait 3 months for the process to happen. You need those parts now. And so the water operators talked a lot about how they just immediately after disaster, if they had extra parts, they had their own network that they would reach out and say, hey, I can send 3 men to help you for the week, or I have a backup generator, I'm not using it. And it kind of just becomes this like trust network of, you don't feel like you are going out of your way to help someone because you know that if your system breaks with a disaster, they will come to you or they will help you out too. So this network of just trust and helping was evident even among the water operators, because they felt like they can't rely on their government. They can't rely on the funding. So those were the 2 points that I had that just really made me think about how do the networks work?
Mhm. Yeah, those are all really great points. So I want to build on a couple of them. The first one I'm thinking about is, when, just a general point that's not necessarily linked to any particular case, but for me, when we focus on coping or incremental measures of adaptation to get through, particular environmental stressors or hazards, I mean, those are clearly very important in the context of state failures, governance failures, and so forth. But I think many people are recognizing that that does take away or divert attention from the kind of root causes of vulnerability or water insecurity. So for example, focusing on incremental measures may not be sufficient to change who has the power to make decisions, who has the resources to acquire certain forms of infrastructure to protect themselves and their household from key impacts, and essentially who has power in society. And all of those factors really underlie these uneven distributions of water security that we see. The other quote, I'm paraphrasing this quote, and I believe it's attributed to Tracy Washington, but you might have heard the quote, "Don't call me resilient because it's something else you can do to me." So I think that's kind of the general spirit of shifting towards understanding and advancing transformations in these root causes that create vulnerability, and kind of moving away from prioritizing adaptations or incremental measures. I think there is definitely a middle ground in terms of how do we balance both, because certain transformations will be lengthy, will take a long time potentially, but we also need to protect marginalized communities and people that face the most impactful risks from environmental hazards. So I think that's just the first point. The second point, just thinking back to my own work in India, is there are kind of two buckets that it falls in. One is this idea of like water struggles. So a lot of the work that I've done has kind of revealed the costs and the trade-offs of failed governance arrangements at the village scale and at the state level. And I wish I had something to kind of shine a positive light on, but there really isn't in that sense, because there are significant trade-offs people have to make, whether it be, purchasing water at a high cost, or, lost income. They have to wait for water until it arrives and then potentially face consequences from their employers. And of course, walking to collect water long distances. And all of these impacts really fall at the intersections of class, caste, and gender in my case studies. So I think, just recognizing that there are huge trade-offs involved in failed governance that permeate all aspects of life that water is connected to, ranging from employment to food to, physical injury, for example, and walking. The other thing is, there are certainly adaptations, particularly in the livelihood context, and that's actually a hallmark of livelihood studies, trying to understand how farmers or pastoralists adapt in contexts of failed governance, failed land reform, historical failures in that regard, and now in context of environmental change, which are amplifying the effects of inequalities. In my research, adaptations have very negative impacts potentially, for example, on the distribution of water within systems. So I'll give you one example. In Western India, specifically in Maharashtra state, there is this notion of farm ponds that has really taken off in the last around 5-6 years. But traditionally, farm ponds are dugout ponds in the ground for which overland runoff seeps in and potentially stores, but really the purpose is to recharge aquifers so that people can collectively benefit from these systems. But in context of water insecurity and scarcity, which is elevated by precipitation variation and interseasonal multi-year droughts, farmers have been taking on subsidies to actually construct farm ponds as raised tanks, which they line with a high micron plastic sheet, a very thick plastic sheet, for which they're actually pumping groundwater in. So groundwater and farm ponds, their farm ponds are not serving as collective recharge pits. They're actually serving as a mechanism to privatize a public resource, that is groundwater. And of course, the people that are able to take advantage of this are well-capitalized farmers, farmers that have access to social and political connections and can acquire subsidies. So that is skewing the distribution of water, groundwater, public resource, in favor of larger landed farmers with higher capital, and potentially impacting, small farmers that may rely on shallow tube wells, that may not be able to drill these huge and deep wells to access water as it comes down, and may not, be able to acquire water for even most basic needs for drinking water, as one example. So, yeah, I don't know. Like, I think my research has focused on kind of the struggles and the maladaptive aspects of adaptation in the context of water insecurity.
Thank you all for sharing all of those experiences. It's been great. And we have our first audience question that actually comes from one of my students right in front of me. You want to shout that out from the front row?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sure. Hi, my name is Abby. So obviously I have a very surface level undergraduate public health, background. I'm not trained in disaster recovery at all, but Victoria, when you're kind of sharing the narrative of, the people proposing to build that wall and the funding body responded back with no, but here's insurance, it kind of trained my mind to think, oh, how much, in this country specifically, obviously it applies globally, how we very much value treatment over prevention, insurance being the treatment and then just building something that would actually be great quality infrastructure as a prevention. So, as three experts, what's the big roadblock? What's the path forward? How do you get politicians and funding bodies to retrain their minds in this field?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of so during my interviews, I definitely ask people what is a barrier to improvement? Like, what is the barrier to improvement to these systems? And it's tricky because almost all of them who had negative perceptions, of course, there were some who said, no, I'm satisfied. But for the ones who said, no, there are some issues and barriers to improvements, they all said government. And so it's tricky, right? When the barrier to improvement is the government itself. And when I asked specifically, what about the government is the barrier to improvement? They said, there are just so many agencies. It's just such a fragmented process that, for example, I can think specifically, one operator themselves said that they had a big break in one of their systems. And yes, they were able to borrow some from other operators, but to permanently fix their problem, they went through 5 different people, because every single time that agency came to take, evaluate it, to see how much money they can provide, to see what's going on, 5 different people were sent. And at the end of the day, you have 5 different people sent. They have their own processes, they have their own mindsets, they have their own way that they like to do things. And they said that it was incredibly frustrating because they would essentially just repeat what they said 5 times. And everyone interpreted differently. And everyone had something new. And so they would have to defend what the last person said. And it was just chaotic and it was just a mess. And they actually said that as of 3 months ago, they were finally able to get the last of their funding to fix this problem. And that was when I did these interviews, it was March 2021. And so that means January, they finally, almost 4 years after Harvey, were finally able to get all the money they needed. So I guess to answer your question, I don't know either just yet. Like I said, I'm still new to this. I'm figuring out the policy side of everything. But the barrier to improvement that people said in my research was the government. And so that just adds a tricky level of how do you fix it then if the people who are supposed to be making the bills to make this process easier are also the ones being the biggest barrier.
Yeah, thanks so much, Victoria. Samir, did you want to chime in also? Yeah.
So I'll speak about this from my context in India, particularly one around drought and livelihoods. And I think the predominant perspective is, and the easy perspective is, oh, there's drought. That must mean a lack of water in a place. So let's move water long physical distances so that people can have access to it. Or let's put down, this check dam in a river to make sure water is stored so that people can have access. Those are important strategies, but they don't go far enough in ensuring everyone has water. for what they need, and it doesn't ensure that water is being used in ways that will ensure the resource is sustainable and plentiful over time. So the way I'm kind of thinking about it is sometimes policymakers forget, in any given village of India, why water is scarce for many and plentiful for few. And they also forget why people use water in the way they do. So this circles back to who has power and resources to actually acquire water in villages. So moving beyond what's available and then towards what's accessible, and also thinking about questions like how crops are actually priced, which crops have value, because farmers will always go for crops that are higher value, that can provide their families a better life, even if they're very water intensive and could potentially undermine public groundwater systems over time. And I think that has a much larger context in terms of people needing to provide for tomorrow's meal or their kids' education. So I think we need to move beyond a very reductive or narrow focus of drought, we need water, towards why do some people have it and others don't, and why are people using it in the way they do. And ultimately, I think, as Victoria mentioned, those are very political questions. Those are questions of governance. They're questions about how policy can be changed to affect those two things. So I would actually go back to the same and say government really matters and the types of policy that it sets. But that's at a much higher level. We also forget, sometimes we forget that, politics are actually sown at the village level. So for example, water struggles in one particular village may be very much related to casteism and patriarchy, and the unwillingness of a certain village head to acquire funds so that other people have water in that village. So we need to take a much more multi-leveled approach towards understanding what is the state, what is the government, and what role does it play in creating these very different patterns of access and potentially unsustainable patterns in water use.
I want to wind us down with one more question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so hi, my name is Christian. I'm a junior majoring in marine affairs, and just really after listening to everything everyone is saying, everyone is very knowledgeable, and I feel like the experiences that everyone has really keys in and adds another layer of understanding to realize what an issue water security is. So I was just kind of writing down everything that was coming to mind that causes water insecurity, so just natural disasters, contamination, and scarcity due to different factors, farming, business, power plants, and then just to key into like a specific maybe solution that I feel like some people might try, but they might face experience from governments or just local ordinances. And that question is, maybe you guys would know, because I've seen different answers, but I thought this is the best group to ask. Why is collecting rainwater illegal in some places? You guys know that answer.
That'll come through.
Didn't get the last part about rainwater.
The most important part of the question was about why rainwater is illegal to collect in some parts of the world. Do any of you have experience with that?
Well, the reason I say that is because, well, at least in Miami, I've heard like different things. So like we collect water, like I live in Homestead, so we collect water in a barrel and water next to that. But I've like read up on some things, and then people are like, oh yeah, no, it's illegal to do that. So it's just like, maybe that's just something I've heard, and it's not too much to back it up, but I've definitely just heard it before. So maybe it's not something that's super like relevant, or I don't know, just something I was thinking about. So
okay, yeah, thanks for that. Just, again, so a student that's from South Florida, where people do collect rainwater, but it's frowned upon in some communities, and it might just be a Board of Health thing, or there may be, or maybe it's urban legend, or I don't know. There's something we've got a whole semester to look into this. That's the good news. So let's do that. But I do want to keep us on time and wind us all down. So in closing, I want to say thank you to all of our panelists and to the audience who've been there, the 30 or so in class with me here, and then the many more that are logged into the webinar online. Let's keep all those around the world dealing with natural and political disasters in our hearts and minds as we wind down today. I want to close by announcing that our September HWISE-NOW will discuss colonias and household water insecurity, and that will be led by our dear colleague, Dr. Amber Wudich of Arizona State University. An announcement is forthcoming on the listserv. You can also watch our events page on the HWISE-RCN website for more details, and I look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you very much, everyone, and please stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.